In this series of videos, we'll look at the era of good feelings during the presidency of James Monroe. With the apparent victory in the War of 1812, or as America assumed it had added victory, a wave of nationalism swept the country, eroding political divisions and creating what became known as the era of good feelings. The Democratic-Republican Party basically operated without any opposition, but with a wave of nationalism, the party had changed itself. It no longer pushed the ideology of state sovereignty and agrarianism that Jefferson had championed. Nationalism sought to lend itself to a developed national economy and a stronger central government. So in many ways, the Democratic-Republican Party had moved toward the old Federalist Party, thus helping to diminish tensions. The air of good feelings coincided with the end of Madison's presidency, the end of the War of 1812, and basically existed throughout the presidency of James Monroe. Monroe was elected in the election of 1816, and he served through the election of 1824. Monroe was born to a wealthy plantation family in Westmoreland County, Virginia, just off the Chesapeake Bay in northern Virginia. It was the same county where George Washington had been born, and later Robert E. Lee would be born. Madison had, at the outbreak of the Revolution, he had just begun college at William and Mary. He was 16, and he really was the last of the last presidents to be part of that revolutionary generation. And by the way, he was the last to wear the style of breeches and wigs and so forth. He joined the army at 16 and fought with Washington and later studied law with Jefferson. He served in the new Virginia legislature and later was governor of Virginia. He had served as a foreign minister to Paris and London and had served also in the U.S. Senate. So, he had this great credentials. He was Madison's Secretary of State before he won his nomination in the presidency. In the 1816 election, after Madison followed the precedent set by Washington and Jefferson and didn't seek a third term, the Democratic-Republican Party nominated Monroe, who was the favorite of Jefferson. The Federalists nominated Rufus King from New York, who had been the party's unsuccessful vice presidential candidate in 1804 and 1808. He didn't expect he didn't expect to win. King didn't, and given the circumstances of the post-War of 1812 nationalism, and he didn't really put forward much of a campaign. In fact, 3 of the states that ended up voting for King all voted with different vice presidential candidates. So you can see the Federalist Party was kind of in disarray. In the end, it was a romp, 183 to 34 in the Electoral College. Monroe picked John Adams' son, John Quincy Adams, as his own Secretary of State. Now, this was significant because at the time, Jefferson, Madison, and Monroe had all served as Secretaries of State before their respective elections, and the position was coming to be seen as sort of a stepping stone to the presidency. On the left here, you can see a portrait of John Quincy Adams about the time of the War of 1812. He lived a long time and lived into when there was photography, and on the right you can see a photograph of him, and he was one of the first photographed presidents. This is obviously much later when photography had been invented. This is in the 1840s, and by the way, it has been colorized. I think it's kind of a cool picture, but you can see what he really looked like. Monroe picked John C. Calhoun as his Secretary of War after Henry Clay from Kentucky refused the position to remain as Speaker of the House. Both Calhoun and Clay would prove critical figures in the coming years. Again, on the left, you can see a portrait of Calhoun when he was about the War of 1812, when he was in Monroe's cabinet. And on the right, you see a photograph of him in the 1850s, about the time of the Civil War approaching. And again, very important figures. 4 years later, in the 1820 election, the Federalists were essentially dissolved and didn't even nominate a candidate. Monroe won every state, and even former Federalist President John Adams voted for Monroe. In fact, the Electoral College vote would have been unanimous had not one New Hampshire elector cast his vote for John Quincy Adams. He did so because he wanted George Washington to remain the only president who had received a unanimous Electoral College vote. In any event, the 1820 vote best illustrates the air of good feelings. I should add here that the Air of Good Feelings was a period of national unity, but there were still some divisions. I don't want to leave the impression that everybody agreed, but there was a sense of nationalism that everybody pretty much shared. In any event, this concludes the introductory video on the Air of Good Feelings.